All right, guys, with the news of GSP announcing his retirement, we thought, why not come on here and have a bit of a discussion with a fellow member of the Backfist Boys. That's right, you know him as Oscar Willis from the Mac Life. He joins us here on this reaction episode of Submission Radio. Oscar, welcome to the program. And before we begin, Cass, I just want to say, just returned this week, did an episode of Submission Radio. Everybody thought that was it for the week, and then bang! He came up with his genius idea to give our reaction to this GSP retirement thing. Well done, my friend.
I thought it was going to be the end of us for the rest of the week. I thought it was smooth sailing, cruisy, a couple of transcripts, you know, rolling in the views. And then a certain French-Canadian decided to throw a bit of a surprise party with a press conference and retire. So here we are, man.
Well, I'll tell you what, there's a bit to talk about. First, I want to get to speaking about everybody's reaction when they found out that this press conference was happening and that GSP was finally announcing his retirement. Cass, what was your reaction to the press conference itself? What did you think of the way sort of GSP spoke, the way that it felt, the vibe, and how it ended up ultimately going?
Well, we sort of got a bit of a preview of that in August when GSP came down here in Melbourne and Sydney for his speaking tour. And he sort of spoke about a lot of the same things. He spoke about his proudest moment being Carlos Condit and, of course, Matt Serra and, you know, what it meant to him to sort of win the middleweight belt. So that articulate, nice, polite side of GSP, we've sort of seen that before. I found it interesting, though, when the news came in that he was going to be throwing a press conference. I kind of thought this seems like public negotiating because GSP's sort of been, you know, in hibernation for a long time now as far as this retirement. We know he's been wanting this Khabib fight, but, you know, it almost became sort of like a running joke. Whenever you would ask GSP what he wanted next, there was that almost infamous interview on the MMA Hour where Ariel sort of ran down through all these opponents, Nate Diaz, Nick Diaz, Ben Askren, Tyron Woodley, all these people, and GSP was like, look, I'm not really interested in any of those guys. So to see him now all of a sudden say, well, I'm going to be retiring, a little bit confusing. What did you think, Oscar?
Well, first of all, guys, you know, first-time caller, long-time listener to the show, so I want to say thank you very much for having me. Secondly, yeah, to hold a press conference and retire is pretty much unheard of in MMA. You know, usually these guys retire, it's because they've either been told to retire by somebody or they've lost so many in a row that's the only option there for them. So to hold a press conference, I was a bit like you guys, you know, sort of, well, this maybe could be negotiations, like, oh, they wouldn't give me the Khabib fight, so I'm going to walk away and maybe try and force the UFC's hand. But watching the press conference itself, I really felt that this was how George felt was the most professional and appropriate way to announce his retirement. So prior to it, I was kind of wondering what the vibe was going to be, but then watching it, I sort of thought, okay, I'll take it at face value, and maybe this is, in fact, the end for GSP.
And I found it interesting when Ariel Helwani did an interview with GSP afterwards, how GSP spoke, that one of his regrets was sort of the way he ended things after the whole Johnny Hendricks situation. So I feel like with his retirement, he almost wanted to kind of write that and be like, all right, this is my official press conference. You know, this is what I want to say. I kind of liked the fact that he was kind of honest about the fact that, look, I wanted to negotiate this Khabib fight. The UFC weren't keen on making it happen. Like, we've been trying to get it done. Like, they want me to sort of stick around and I don't know what my future is going to be. And I guess that brings up the interesting question of, when it comes to the UFC, did they make the right decision by not making this Khabib fight? Because you kind of look at it from a couple of angles. One is, this is a huge fight, and, you know, a guy like GSP, another guy like that may not come around for a while. But at the same time, there's also that argument of, what if GSP beat Khabib and then retired? Where does that leave the UFC? Oscar, what do you think about the UFC's decision to not put this fight together?
I mean, you hit the nail on the head. That's obviously where they're going with it. I think Dana took GSP coming back, winning the middleweight title, and then sort of throwing it back to them. I think Dana kind of took that maybe a little bit personally, and he was refusing to let something. I think he was refusing like something like that to happen again. You know, maybe even if they did a catch weight, you know, if GSP beats Khabib, Khabib's star still falters and GSP walks off into the sunset. So as George himself has said, the Dana will do what's best for him and GSP will do what's best for him. In this case, Dana has done what's best for him. I will note, though, I find it interesting that they're not going to play this game with GSP, but they are going to play this game with Lesnar. And let Lesnar walk and fight somebody, and then potentially bounce. I just find that interesting. It sort of makes me wonder if they think, well, he might win that. He probably won't win that. I wonder if that's some part of it. But yeah, I think Dana did the right thing for the UFC.
I thought about that as well. And I think part of it is that, they said they had plans for Khabib. I almost feel like at some points they don't really have plans for the heavyweight division. They may have loose plans, but it doesn't seem like there's one guy that they're sort of investing all their eggs into when it comes to the heavyweight division. With Khabib, I'm fascinated what the UFC's plans are there, especially long-term, because Khabib's another guy who's talking about, I might retire in a few fights. It is good to see for once the UFC sort of sticking to somewhat of a structure. Again, it depends. I mean, if they do some kind of ridiculous fight with Khabib, maybe that's all thrown out the window. But if it is to, say, fight Tony Ferguson or Dustin Poirier or some contender in the division, then I'm all for it, even though as a fan, it's a bit of a shame not to see GSP versus Khabib. That would have been, a really, really fun fight. Having said that, I can still see this fight happening maybe in a year or two. If Khabib said, and he did say to us, Tony Ferguson, GSP, Floyd Mayweather, that's what he wants. So if he does beat Tony Ferguson, maybe one more contender, and if he is serious and his father is serious about potentially retiring in 2-3 fights, then you've got a Khabib who's on his way out. You've got a GSP who will probably fight once and then go back into retirement. What is the loss there? That is somewhat the end of the UFC's investment in Khabib and GSP. Why not make that fight? And GSP sort of left that open. I think the best question of the press conference was, if Dana White called you tomorrow and offered you that Khabib fight, what would you do? And here we are at a retirement press conference, and GSP's like, I don't know. I don't know how I'll feel in a few weeks. I don't know how I'll feel in a few months. You don't know how you'll feel. The whole point of this exercise is that you won't feel any different way. This is official. This is retirement. So I still think this fight can potentially happen maybe in a year or two.
Yeah, and it's funny how we talk about it as a retirement press conference where GSP so clearly left it open to possibly fighting again against Khabib. And I think you're right, Casper. I mean, look, let's look at it like this. If Cowboy Cerrone fights Conor McGregor and somehow Conor McGregor loses that fight and he's out of this whole picture situation with Khabib, if Khabib does beat Tony Ferguson next, I mean, GSP would be the logical choice. And let's not forget this. I mean, Khabib kind of does what he wants. I know right now the UFC is still sort of conducting what happens to him next, but I imagine with the more wins he gets, the more power he's going to have. And I could see a situation where even if the UFC don't want Khabib to fight GSP, Khabib still finds a way to get it done, especially with Ali being his manager. They're very influential. They can get stuff done that a lot of other fighters couldn't.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, if we look at the way the UFC landscape is right now, they respond to what's the best story they can tell. And GSP laid it out today. If they were going to approach me as maybe the movie sort of style of the old hero coming back to try and vanquish the undefeatable monster, hey, maybe I'll answer that phone call. I think he laid it out for them. Let's say Khabib rattles off 5 more wins, or maybe even 2 more wins over, let's say, Ferguson, Poirier, or maybe a Holloway if he's in there, or a McGregor rematch if that happens. Let's say Khabib rattles that off. Then, if you're the UFC, you're like, well, there's no one else clear-cut. Why don't we do the movie Rocky style, bring the old hero back to fight? Done. It just makes sense at that point.
I also feel that if GSP did, in fact, purposely leave everything open. And again, I'm not saying that this is public negotiation. I think maybe there was 1% of that. I think GSP in his mind is officially retired until something comes up. But I remember Dana White saying, look, we don't really know what GSP's worth is these days. He's been away from the sport for so long. This is obviously prior to the Michael Bisping fight. And I think GSP calling this press conference and you've got all this mainstream media there covering it is kind of a good example of like, well, hey, a lot of people do care. You see the headlines that this is generating. You see all the broad media outlets that showed up. It's a good way to show to the UFC from GSP that, hey, look, a lot of people do care. There is a lot of interest. I was also going to say, if this is the last time we see GSP, I don't really blame him because, like I mentioned before, those opponents that he didn't really care about, if Khabib really is the only guy that could draw him out, that could sort of interest him, he mentioned he doesn't have that hunger. He doesn't want to, become, say, the welterweight champion again and fight on and beat contenders. And if Khabib's the only guy that he wanted and that fight wasn't going to happen, I understand him not wanting to sort of stay on the hook, on the UFC's hook, and kind of be like, look, maybe I'll stick around for 2 years, maybe not, until you guys make your decision. So I do think ultimately this was the right call for him.
But you guys also got to think about GSP like this. This is a guy that mentally, has to deal with stress. He's not great with all this mental pressure. And I think for him, constantly being called out by guys like Tyron Woodley, constantly being in the headlines, oh, who GSP going to fight, blah, blah, blah. I think for him, that was like a big problem that he dealt with everyday life. Anytime I bet he walked into a restaurant or went down the street, someone's like, oh, why don't you fight blah, blah, blah? Why don't you fight this guy, this guy, that guy? So I think for him, the retirement press conference is a way to send everybody a message. Look, I'm done. I'm gone. Like, stop trying to put me up against all these guys. I have no interest. I have interest with Khabib. We'll see what happens. But Tyron Woodley, who, by the way, went on Instagram, was like, oh, that's a shame. I was going to call him out after my win. It's like, yeah, you wish, Tyron Woodley. I'm sure GSP's going to choose to fight you next. Oh, man, that guy, seriously. But, like, all these guys now know you can't jump on and just call GSP out. He's out of running. He's out of contention. He has no interest in fighting anybody unless it's Khabib. And I think for him, it's a big deal to make this clear. So that's another interesting thing, I guess, that he set out to do and did with his press conference. I guess the question is as well, when you look at GSP and sort of what he's done in his legacy, what do you guys think? A lot of people are sort of discussing if the UFC could ever build up a guy like him who doesn't talk trash in the era that we have now. Because back in GSP's era, he was on pay-per-views all the time because the UFC didn't have the programming like it has now. He was always he was one of the rare crop of fighters that was always sort of on a pay-per-view, always sort of watched by a lot of people, and he came up that way. But also, in regards to that discussion, and I know a lot of people online are saying, look, that can't happen, this can't happen. I want to bring up the fact that if you don't go too long ago into GSP's career, and I'm talking about, like, let's look at his Dan Hardy fight, let's look at his Jake Shields fight. I mean, a lot of people weren't very high on GSP and his fight style. Do you guys remember around that time, a lot of people were saying, oh, he's boring, he does anything he could not to fight. This was before this. I mean, when he fought Carlos Condit and he got kicked in the head, and by the way, he said that was one of his sort of highlights coming back from that. And then he fought Johnny Hendricks and, survived that, and obviously Michael Bisping. Now everybody's like, whoa, like his legacy's awesome and he's done amazing things. But it wasn't that long ago where in 2011 people were kind of shitting on him a little bit and not really giving him the credit that he deserves. So when people say, oh, like GSP is a rarity and no one else can be built up, like, I don't know. Where do you guys fall on that? On being built up in this area without talking trash and being in the position GSP's in? Because I think other fighters could do it.
Well, I agree with you, Dennis. I think people have forgotten, almost a bit like Jose Aldo, actually. People forget that when they were in their prime, they weren't the most liked fighters. They were so dominant, it was dull. I remember GSP used to be compared to the Klitschko's in boxing, these decision machines that you don't have to pay to watch them, even though you did. You don't have to pay to watch them because you know the result. And it's one of those cases where now they're gone, people appreciate what they had more often. And I think, so I completely agree with that. As far as a person of GSP in today's sort of climate of mixed martial arts, I do think he could be the last of a dying breed. He might not be the last one. I remember Aaron Pico in Bellator sort of carries himself like a very sort of, humble but hungry martial artist. But I think outside of that, I don't see anybody young and up and coming who sort of personifies that. And that's okay. I just think the era of it's like, as the UFC's gotten older, it's gotten further away from traditional martial arts. There's not so much geese to the cage anymore. And we're just moving away from that. And I think that's sort of part and parcel of what's going on now. And I think GSP, I don't think there will be another GSP. I don't think there'll be another GSP in the octagon or out the octagon.
I think sort of people are appreciating GSP now that they've taken a step back and also compared him to some of the other greats. I remember Nogueira, who was obviously one of my favorites growing up, sort of watching him in Pride and seeing the way that he went out, seeing guys like, say, Tito Ortiz or even Vitor Belfort. And then when you compare a guy like GSP, who just did everything on his own terms, held a press conference to announce his retirement, went out on a massive win streak, holding titles. I think now people understand the gravity of that situation when compared to so many of these great... Fedor, we don't really even need to go there. There's so many of the greats that were once greats sort of don't leave on their own terms, and I think that's why people appreciate what GSP's done. Also, I think GSP was sort of the perfect guy for that time where people were sort of talking about, MMA and mixed martial arts and labeling everybody as cage fighters, as these animals. And GSP was the first guy to sort of bring class and obviously wear suits at press conferences. And now you see everybody doing that. It's very common. But he's sort of the first guy to sort of elevate the sport at that time where we didn't have that understanding that we do have now.
It's very interesting. I mean, before we wrap this thing up, I want to get you guys' thoughts on GSP's legacy and I suppose what you guys think of what he's done. Look, I don't want to put out this whole, like, is he the greatest of all time thing? Because I don't believe in that. I don't think that's a real thing. But what do you guys think of what he's been able to do in the sport? And if this is, let's say this is it. Let's say this is actually a real retirement and he doesn't fight again. Oscar, what do you think of what GSP has achieved in his career? And sort of, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so earlier today, like you said, there's no need to get into the GOAT conversation. Artem Lobov has that wrapped up.
But you can, Oscar. Look, if you think he's the greatest of all time, I don't want to stop you from saying it. If you believe this is the greatest guy of all time, you can say it. I don't want to get in your way. Or you're way with Casper.
But what I was thinking was, if you compare, let's say there's 5 names usually in that conversation: Fedor, Demetrius Johnson, John Jones, Anderson, and GSP. If you compare their careers, I actually think GSP's is probably the career that any young fighter would want. There's the 3 generations he defeated, 2 belts in 2 divisions, and not a controversy to be seen. I really think if you look at his legacy, if you hear Dana White say about Daniel Cormier, if I could have any of this guy, that's who I'd have, right? If I could have one champion to be like him, I'm stumbling over my words here. But GSP, if you wanted to build a guy who's perfect for mainstream, handsome fella, not sure about the accent, but, it would be GSP, right? He's just, I think his legacy will be the consummate professional, and he'll be remembered as one of, if not the greatest of all time. I really think that's what it comes down to.
I think similar to what you said, Oscar, I think GSP's career is kind of like the fairy tale that everybody strives for, and essentially nobody else has, and nobody else probably will ever have. The way that he did everything on his own terms, the belts that he won, the fact that he was able to avenge all of his losses, all while keeping things classy, being a massive, massive star in his own country. I think, though, I'm not really going to get into the whole GOAT discussion. I think the lines are sort of too blurred, but I think those are sort of added factors when you discuss the GOAT, and I think GSP is definitely up there.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you what, like you guys said, the fighting, the winning, the fact that everybody that he's lost to and that he's beaten, that's kind of on the side for me. But like you guys mentioned, the fact that he's been able to go out on his own terms and have a really lovely legacy and not be like a Chuck Liddell or and no disrespect, but even being like an Anderson Silva and a lot of these guys who fall in the middle of the octagon. And it's kind of like, for this story, Santa Claus is real, and the storybook ending is there. And I don't know how many guys you could go through in combat sports. I mean, I usually have a picture of Muhammad Ali behind me, but man, that guy has had a rough run at the end of his career. You guys look at guys like Mike Tyson. A lot of these icons for a lot of people, you have to see them fall. So for GSP, I mean, if he stays retired, this could be truly a storybook, picturesque ending for him. So in that regard, I think that's an absolutely remarkable achievement. Just quickly, just speaking a little bit about his numbers, Lesnar, he was on Lesnar versus Mia 2. That got 1.3 million pay-per-view buys, UFC 100. Him versus BJ Penn 2, UFC 94, 920,000 pay-per-view buys. Super impressive. You look at him versus Nick Diaz, 950 pay-per-view buys. Him versus Michael Bisping, 875,000 pay-per-view buys. That was when the UFC wasn't sure if anybody had any interest in him. So not only has the guy been able to have a remarkable career, but he has drawn a lot of views over the time. Before we wrap up, what else do you guys have to say? Anything else on the matter?
I was just sort of adding to sort of the discussion before. I think what's interesting about GSP is the way that he's decided, look, I'm going to go out on top. And that's kind of what adds to that fairy tale where, like, you think, what if Anderson Silva retired after maybe the Stephan Bonner fight? Or what if Fedor retired before I don't know, maybe after the Brett Rogers fight, before everything sort of went downhill. I feel like their cases for being the GOAT would be a lot stronger, and yeah, we would have extra years of their career that we never would have seen, but that image, that aura of them would have been forever preserved. We wouldn't see them going down this downward slope. And that's exactly what GSP has basically achieved. I feel like it's almost like chasing the dragon. Fighters, this is what they do, this is what they love, and when they retire, they don't really know what else to do. And, you see them taking this unnecessary damage. And GSP he acknowledges and he understands that, look, it is very tempting to stay in. This is what I do. This is what I love. But I don't want to end up like, and he didn't name anyone, but he didn't want to end up like another one of those fighters, another statistic. So I think that's something else that you got to commend GSP on for sort of avoiding that temptation.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I think one thing that we forget about GSP as well is because he was so dominant in the cage, it's almost like, he never really overcame adversity, But actually, as Dennis said earlier, the guy struggled with anxiety quite clearly throughout his career. So while he may not have had adversity regularly in the cage, he did overcome adversity outside the cage. So I think sometimes GSP is almost too clean cut, right? He's almost too pretty and handsome. But actually, he had battles that he overcame. He had a fighter's spirit more than I think he's given credit for. So that, for me, is the biggest takeaway from today, GSP retiring, is that the guy was about as traditional a martial artist fighter as you can get.
Well, there you guys go. I guess the big question now is, how long will GSP, I suppose, accept the offer from the UFC? I mean, what's the time frame if they call him and say this Khabib fight's on? I wonder in his mind if he's got an age 39, 38, 37. He said he'll be fishing, and he'll pick up the phone and be like, oh, hey, this does sound exciting to me. So the big question is, if the UFC do change their mind in 3 years' time, will he pick up the call and take the fight? At 40 years old, I guess we'll find out. It could be a different discussion, fellas, if that comes true. Of course, Oscar Willis from the Mac Life. Make sure to check all their stuff out. Oscar, UFC 235 around the corner. Just quickly, what can people expect from your coverage? You do a great job.
Oh, mate, just, full to the top of excellent quality content, fast and delivered straight to you.
Wow. Well, if there's a Ben Askren interview, a one-on-one, I can't wait to see it. Guys, thanks for tuning in. UFC 235 preview submission radio next week. With that, have a great weekend, and we'll catch you then.